The sun had barely risen beyond the horizon, yet the air in the dye workshop was already thick with the pungent odors of simmering concoctions. A boy, scarcely more than 12 summers, knelt before a vast cauldron, the edges blackened from years of use. His hands, stained with vibrant hues of blue and green, trembled as he stirred the viscous liquid, a blend of indigo and lye that danced with malevolent beauty. The weight of the wooden paddle pressed against his slight frame, a constant reminder of his toil. As he dipped the paddle into the cauldron, a plume of steam rose sharply, curling around his face like a serpent seeking warmth. He winced as it brushed against his skin, the acrid vapor stinging his eyes, a harsh reminder that the dyes were not merely colors, but harbingers of suffering. His master, a burly man with a thick beard, barked commands from the shadowy corner of the workshop, too preoccupied with his own tasks to notice the boy's discomfort. "Faster! The cloth won't dye itself!" he roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls, drowning out the muffled sounds of the bustling market beyond. The boy resumed his work, bending over the cauldron, his back protesting with each movement. The dyes made from lead oxide and arsenic were known to poison the unwary, but such knowledge was a luxury he could ill afford. His fingers ached from the constant stirring, yet he pressed on, for the fear of punishment was greater than the fear of illness. A rash had begun to bloom across his forearms, red and angry, as if the very dyes he handled sought to consume him. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a tightness that warned of something more sinister lurking within. Each day bled into the next, a relentless cycle of labor that robbed him of his youth. The workshop was a cacophony of color and sound, but beneath its vibrancy lay a grim reality. The boy's fellow workers, older and weary, exhibited the telltale signs of exposure: pale skin mottled with dark patches, ragged coughs that echoed like ghosts, and eyes that glistened with a dull sheen. None spoke of their ailments, for to voice the truth was to invite despair. Instead, they exchanged knowing glances, the silent acknowledgement of their shared plight, binding them closer than any spoken word. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat intensified, and the boy found himself gasping for breath. The air, thick with chemicals, felt like a noose tightening around his throat. He glanced towards the door, where a glimmer of daylight beckoned, longing to escape the suffocating gloom of the workshop. But outside lay the world of men, where weakness was scorned, and vulnerability was a sin. He shoved the thought away, and immersed himself once more in the dyes, the colors swirling chaotically, reflecting the turmoil in his heart. Harsh and rasping, startling him back to reality. His hand instinctively flew to his mouth, and he tasted the bitter tang of iron on his tongue, a warning of the damage being wrought upon his fragile body. The master's voice rose again, snapping him from his reverie. "Enough dawdling, we have orders to fill." With a heavy sigh, the boy resumed his labor, the weight of the cauldron's burden settling deeper into his bones. Each stroke of the paddle felt like a surrender to fate, a resignation to a life dictated by toxic dyes and the shadow of mortality. In that moment, amidst the swirling colors and the oppressive heat, the boy understood that while the world outside may have been vibrant and alive, his own existence was but a ghostly hue, fading with every passing day. In the dimly lit confines of the dye house, the air was heavy with the acrid scent of crushed woad and madder root. Sunlight, filtering weakly through the grimy windows, illuminated a scene of toil and tribulation. Young boys no older than 12 bent over cauldrons, their hands submerged in the swirling, viscous liquid that promised vibrant hues yet concealed a bitter truth. The boy known as Alaric gritted his teeth as he plunged his fingers into the scalding brew, a vivid azure swirling around his hands. The heat was relentless, a searing reminder that the work was not for the faint-hearted. As he stirred, the rough wooden handle of the paddle dug into his palm, a small discomfort overshadowed by the impending sting of the dye. With each pass of the paddle, the dye splashed against his forearms, leaving behind a trail of deepening blue. A moment's negligence was all it took. The caustic concoction seeped into the cracks of his skin, igniting a familiar burn. Alaric bit back a cry, his eyes stinging from the fumes that hung heavy in the air, a noxious miasma that clung to the walls like a specter. Nearby, another boy, Joram, yelped as he withdrew his hand from the cauldron, revealing angry red welts that blossomed across his wrist. "Curse this cursed dye!" he exclaimed, shaking his hand frantically as if to dislodge the pain. The boys around him glanced up, their faces a tapestry of exhaustion and despair. They all bore the marks of their trade, blistered fingers, peeling skin, and the telltale signs of infection that often cloaked their limbs in misery. The master dyer, a burly man named Garrick, loomed over them, his voice a gruff rasp. "Less whining, more stirring. We have quotas to meet." His impatience crackled in the air like the sparks from the forge, a harsh reminder that the boy's suffering was but a cog in the relentless machinery of the dye trade. Alaric's thoughts drifted as he continued to stir, each motion a grim exercise in endurance. He recalled the tales of gallant knights and noble lords, their fine garments, shimmering in the sun, woven with threads dyed in colors that spoke of wealth and power. Yet here he was, a mere boy, toiling in obscurity, his skin a canvas of irritation and pain. The vibrant colors he helped create would never adorn his own back. They were meant for those who would never know the cost of such beauty. As the hours dragged on, the pain became a dull throb, a constant reminder of his plight. Alaric's fingers were raw, and the skin around his wrists was mottled with angry red patches, oozing and festering. He watched helplessly as Joran, driven by despair, pressed a cloth to his own wounds, only to wince further as the fabric pulled at the tender flesh. "Keep your focus on your work," Garrick barked, his shadow looming like a storm cloud, casting a pall over the already bleak atmosphere. The threat of punishment for idle hands hung heavily in the air, stifling any murmurs of camaraderie amongst the boys. In that moment, the reality of their existence settled like a weight upon Alaric's chest. Each day was a battle against not only the dyes that stained their hands, but also against the very nature of their labor. The vibrant colors held promise, yet they came with a price that left the boys battered, bruised, and trapped in a cycle of suffering that seemed to have no end. In the dim light of early morn, the dye house lay shrouded in a haze of steam and color. The air was thick with the acrid scent of crushed woad and madder root, a pungent reminder of the day's toil yet to unfold. Young boys, barely out of their childhood, shuffled through the door, weary-eyed and already burdened by the weight of their labor. Among them was Ewan, his back hunched, hands calloused and stained a deep indigo, a testament to countless hours spent bending over bubbling cauldrons. With a gruff command from the master dyer, the boys set to work. Ewan found himself at the forefront, stirring a pot of boiling dye, the heavy iron ladle slipping through his grasp as he strained against the heat that radiated from the cauldron. Each motion required a deliberate effort, the repetitive action of stirring tugging at the muscles in his arms and back. The rhythm was relentless, a cruel metronome that drove him deeper into fatigue. As the sun climbed, its rays filtering through the grime-coated windows, the pain began its slow creep. Ewan felt it first in his lower back, a dull ache that throbbed in time with the pounding of his heart. He grimaced, but there was no time for weakness in a trade that demanded both strength and endurance. The master's eye was ever watchful, and a boy caught slacking would face the whip, a cruel reminder of the stakes involved in their craft. With each pot lifted, laden with the rich, viscous liquid, Ewan's body protested, the strain in his joints becoming a bitter companion. The heavy pots were unwieldy, a testament to the toxic dyes they contained, and as he hoisted one onto the table, a jolt of pain shot through his shoulder, causing him to drop it clumsily. The dye splattered onto the flagstone floor, its vibrant hue a mockery of his clumsiness. A sharp reprimand from the master sliced through the haze of fatigue, and Ewan quickly set to mopping up the mess, the repetitive motion of scrubbing igniting fresh waves of agony through his wrists. As the day wore on, the weight of the dye and the strain of the work began to take their toll. The boys took turns stirring and lifting, but for Ewan, each movement felt like a betrayal of his own flesh, aching and unwilling to obey. The skin of his arms bore the marks of contact with the caustic dyes, raw and blistered, a grim reminder of the cost of their trade. Even the water used to rinse the pots was tainted, causing irritation that turned the simple act of washing into a trial of endurance. Evening approached, the fading light casting long shadows across the dye house. Ewan felt the familiar pull in his muscles as he bent once more to fetch a new pot, the burden heavier than it had been in the morning. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as his knee buckled under the weight, sending him sprawling to the ground, his body rebelling against the work that had consumed his youth. The others paused, their own labors momentarily halted, and Ewan could feel their eyes on him, some in pity, others in fear that they too might one day be forced to face the same fate. In the quiet that followed, the master's voice broke through the silence, a harsh reminder that there was no place for weakness in the dye house. Ewan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to rise, knowing that the days ahead promised little respite. The pain was a constant companion, and he could only hope that it would not steal away the very ability to perform the work that bound him to this life. The air within the dye workshop lay heavy with the stench of boiled woad and matter, swirling together in a miasma of color and decay. The room, dimly lit by flickering tallow candles, felt more like a tomb than a place of labor. Young boys, no older than 10 or 12, bent over steaming cauldrons, their faces slick with sweat as they stirred the viscous mixtures with long wooden paddles. The heat of the boiling dyes mingled with the oppressive humidity, creating an atmosphere that stifled breath and spirit alike. Beneath a low ceiling, the boys toiled on, their sinewy arms straining under the weight of their tasks. The constant bending and stirring dulled their senses, turning each motion into a repetitive blur. With every stir, the noxious fumes clung to their skin, seeping into the pores and tightening around their throats. Coughs echoed through the workshop, a chorus of suffering that rose above the hiss of the fire and the bubbling dyes. Little Thomas, who had recently turned 11, coughed more often than not, his face pale and drawn. "Keep stirring, lad," barked Master Eldred, his voice a harsh whip cracking through the haze. His eyes, sunken and weary, were filled with a dispassionate cruelty, as though the boy's suffering was merely an inconvenience in his relentless pursuit of profit. Thomas grimaced, feeling the rough wood of the paddle dig into his palms, but he dared not slacken his pace. The threat of the master's wrath loomed larger than the cauldron's heat, and the fear of punishment drove him on with a grim determination. The dyes they worked with were as toxic as they were vibrant. Each hue, deep indigo, fiery red, and rich violet, held the promise of beauty, yet came at a heavy price. Skin contact often resulted in rashes that burned like fire, and the boys bore the marks of their labor like badges of shame. Thomas's hands were stained blue, the dye seeping into the cracks of his skin, a constant reminder of his toil. He watched as his friend Edwin scratched at his forearm, the skin raw and inflamed from exposure, but there was little time for sympathy or relief. The workshop's pace was relentless, and each boy knew that to falter was to invite disaster. "Faster, faster," the master shouted, and the air grew thicker with urgency. Fatigue clawed at their bones, but the fear of reprisal pushed them onward. They were little more than cogs in a grim machine, expected to produce vibrant fabrics for the town's wealthier citizens, their own suffering unseen and unacknowledged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cramped space, the boys felt the weight of despair settle upon them. Outside, the world thrived with the promise of life, yet within these walls, hope was a distant memory. The stench of boiling dyes and the oppressive heat smothered laughter and dreams alike. Each day blended into the next, a monotony of toil that drained their spirits and filled their lungs with poison. The workshop, their prison, loomed large in their minds, a place where boyhood was swallowed whole by the relentless demands of survival. With each cauldron stirred, Thomas realized that the vibrant colors they created would never be matched by the hues of joy or freedom. And as the last flicker of daylight surrendered to night, the boys settled into the familiar rhythm of despair, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a weary light over the village of Eldridge, where the scent of damp wool mingled unpleasantly with the acrid tang of dye. In the small workshop, nestled between the blacksmith's forge and the baker's stall, young Thomas labored, his hands stained in shades of indigo and crimson, the remnants of a day's toil. The air was heavy, thick with the fumes of toxic dyes, and the sound of the bubbling cauldron echoed through the narrow space, a constant reminder of the precariousness of his trade. As the seasons turned, so too did the fortunes of the dye workers. With spring's arrival came fresh demand for vibrant hues. the noble class eager to adorn themselves in the latest fashions. But now, as summer approached, the colors of autumn lingered in the minds of the wealthy, and the requests for dyed textiles dwindled. It was a cruel irony that the very labor meant to brighten the lives of others often dimmed the prospects of those who toiled for such vibrancy. Thomas's back ached from endless bending, the muscles taut and strained as he stirred the cauldron, each rotation a reminder of the labor that might yield nothing but disappointment. The repetitive motion, day in and day out, wore on him. The skin of his hands blistered and cracked from the harsh chemicals, his fingers trembling as he worked. He recalled the tales of master dyers who had built grand houses, but such dreams felt like distant stars, unreachable and cold. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the workshop floor, a familiar anxiety gripped his heart. He glanced at the small wooden chest in the corner, its contents dwindling. The coins earned from the last batch of dyed cloth had barely covered the cost of bread and ale, let alone the needs of his younger siblings. His father had fallen ill, unable to work the fields, and the burden of their survival lay heavy on Thomas's shoulders. The thought of returning home empty-handed gnawed at him, a bitter reminder of his inadequacies. The door creaked open, and a figure emerged, cloaked in a rich fabric that shimmered with hues of emerald and gold. It was Lord Halford's steward, an imposing man whose presence sent a shiver through the very marrow of Thomas's bones. The steward's gaze swept the workshop, disdainful as he appraised the quality of the dyed cloth hanging from the rafters. "I require 100 yards of deep blue, lad," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "But I will not pay for a color less than perfect." Thomas nodded, the weight of the world pressing down anew. The Lord's whims dictated his worth, and each order was a gamble, a chance to stave off hunger for another week. Yet the dyes were fickle, and the cauldron could turn from vibrant azure to dull gray in an instant. A single misstep could lead to ruin, the steward's scorn a swift dagger. Leaving the door to swing closed behind him, Thomas inhaled deeply, choking on the fumes that filled the air. The uncertainty of the days to come loomed before him like a dark cloud, and in that moment he felt the crushing weight of expectation and fear. The sun might rise again tomorrow, but for him, the future felt as unpredictable as the colors he sought to master. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a muted light over the narrow streets of the village, where the scent of earth mingled with the acrid fumes of the dye workshop. In the dimly lit interior, the boy, scarcely more than a lad of 14, hunched over a cauldron, the heat from the fire licking his face as he stirred the viscous liquid within. His fingers, stained with deep shades of indigo and crimson, bore witness to his toil, yet the colors were not merely a mark of his craft, they were a badge of his social exile. Outside, the villagers moved about their evening tasks, their laughter a distant echo that only served to heighten the boy's sense of isolation. Whispers flitted through the air, like errant shadows, dark and foreboding. "Beware the dye worker," they muttered, eyes narrowing as they caught sight of him. "His hands are tainted with poison, and his craft brings ill fortune." The boy's heart sank with each furtive glance cast his way, each word like a dagger, thrusting deeper into the wound of his solitude. He had been born into this life, apprenticed to a master whose hands were as calloused as his own. Every day was a relentless cycle of bending and stirring, the labor demanding and unyielding. The dyes concocted from the roots and leaves of plants were known for their beauty, yet they held a secret that twisted the tongues of those who spoke of them. The boy's skin had begun to take on a sickly pallor, the toxins seeping into his very being, and with each passing day, the whispers grew louder. "Look at him, a walking grave," one woman had exclaimed, clutching her child close as they passed the workshop. "His presence taints the air." The boy's shoulders sagged at the memory, the weight of their disdain, a burden he wore like a cloak. He often dreamed of joining the village boys in their games, of running freely through the meadows instead of laboring beneath the oppressive weight of the cauldron's steam. But the rumors held him captive, a prisoner of his own craft. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthened, and the boy's task began to blur with the encroaching twilight. He dipped his hands into the cauldron once more, the heat biting at his fingertips as he pulled up a bundle of cloth, now transformed into a vibrant hue. Yet even this triumph felt hollow. No one would adorn themselves in garments dyed by his hand, no one would celebrate his skill. Instead, They would look upon him with fear, as if he were a spectral figure emerging from the mist. A sudden crash from outside interrupted his thoughts. A basket overturned, spilling its contents onto the cobblestones. The boy's heart raced as he glanced out the window. A group of village children had gathered, their laughter ringing out as they taunted a straggler who had stumbled into their midst. "Look at the dye worker's boy. He will poison you all." Their voices, a chorus of derision. The boy's cheeks burned with shame, his hands trembling as he clenched them into fists. He yearned to defend himself, to shout that it was not the dyes that made him wretched, but the isolation they wrought. Yet the fear in their eyes held him back, a reminder that he was forever marked by the very craft that sustained him. The cauldron bubbled ominously, and with it, the boy felt the weight of his fate, caught between the vibrant colors of his work and the dull shades of his desolation. In the dim light of dawn, the air hung thick with the acrid scent of burnt indigo and the sharp tang of anise. Young boys, barely out of their childhood, shuffled to the dye pots, their faces smudged with the remnants of the previous day's labor. The wooden beams of the dye house loomed overhead like the heavy weight of their futures, casting long shadows that mirrored the gloom that settled in their hearts. As the day began, Aldrich, a boy of 13 summers, bent low over a cauldron of bubbling liquid. His hands, stained a permanent shade of blue, ached from the ceaseless task of stirring. Each rotation of the wooden paddle demanded a strength that belied his age, the muscles in his arms burning under the strain. The repetitive motion was a cruel mockery of life, a cycle that seemed destined to repeat itself without end. With every bend of his back, he felt the weight of futility settle upon him like a heavy cloak. The dyeing trade, a grimy profession relegated to the fringes of society, had no glamour, no grand prospects. Aldrich had often watched the merchants and artisans with their fine clothes and booming laughter, their lives filled with purpose and ambition. To be a dye worker meant being seen as lowly, a mere cog in the wheel of commerce, one whose craft was deemed unworthy of respect. There was little hope for advancement. The elders of the dye house spoke of their years spent in the same weary roles, their dreams as faded as the colors they labored to create. "Stir that pot, boy," grunted Gunter, the master dyer, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. The man's hands, thick and calloused, moved with practiced ease as he prepared a batch of crimson dye. Aldrich inhaled the noxious fumes, a cloud of toxic smoke curling around him, a constant reminder of the perils that lurked in every dye pot. The risks were unspoken yet well understood. Skin infections and respiratory ailments were the price of their trade, the cruel toll exacted by the vibrant hues they sought to produce. Yet for Aldrich, the worst was not the physical labor or the threat of illness, but the unyielding stagnation of his existence. Each day bled into the next, a monotonous rhythm of toil that offered no promise of a better tomorrow. He knew that at the end of his apprenticeship he would still be bound to the dye house, a mere worker among many, forever stirring the pots, forever bending to the master's will. The thought of spending his whole life in this dank, color-sodded chamber, with the cries of the street children echoing just beyond the door, gnawed at his spirit. The shadows deepened as the sun rose higher, but the brightness outside was only a cruel reminder of what lay beyond the confines of the dye house. The laughter of noblemen and the sweet melodies of minstrels drifted in through the open windows, mocking the plight of those trapped within. Aldrich clenched his jaw, determined to endure, yet the fire of ambition within him flickered like a candle in a storm, threatened to be extinguished by the relentless grind of his daily existence. As the cauldron hissed and bubbled, Aldrich's heart sank further into despair. The colors they created were beautiful, yet they were nothing more than illusions, mere distractions from the drab reality of their lives. In the world of dyeing, dreams were but faded hues, washed away by the currents of despair, leaving only a stain upon the soul. The air hung heavy in the cramped chamber, a mingling of dampness and the acrid tang of boiling liquid. Beneath the dim light filtering through a grimy window, the boy bent low over a cauldron, his hands submerged in the thick, swirling concoction of crushed woad leaves, their vibrant blue fading into a murky hue. The task was laborious, requiring both strength and dexterity, yet the boy's weary body strained against the unyielding demands of the dyeing process. The heat from the cauldron seeped through the ragged fabric of his tunic, mingling with the sweat that dripped from his brow, blurring the line between labor and torment. Only weeks prior, the market had brimmed with color, the stalls alive with the vibrant hues of natural dyes sourced from distant lands. Now, however, the boy and his master, a grizzled man with more gray than black in his beard, stood at the mercy of fickle trade routes and poor harvests. The master had returned from the last market trip empty-handed, the colorful bounty of the season reduced to mere whispers of what once was. "The supplier has failed us," he had grumbled, his fists slamming against the wooden table. "No matter, no logwood, only tales of storms and ill fortune." The boy's heart sank. With the absence of quality materials, the dyeworks were forced to make do with inferior substitutes, leaves gathered from the forest floor, or roots that had long since lost their color. Each batch brewed in the cauldron bore the weight of uncertainty, a reflection of their desperate dependency on the whims of nature and trade. As he stirred the mixture, the boy's fingers tingled from the toxic fumes rising in thick, acrid clouds, seeping into his skin and lungs, a slow poison that promised more than just discolored garments. "More heat," the master barked, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. The boy obeyed, shoveling additional wood into the fire, flames licking hungrily at the cauldron. The heat intensified, and beads of sweat trickled down his temples, blurring his vision. He could sense the tension in the air, a palpable dread that coiled in his stomach. If the dye failed to hold, if the colors faded under the sun, they would be left with nothing but angry customers and empty pockets. With each passing hour, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the workshop. The boy's limbs ached from the repetition of bending and stirring. His skin prickled from the harsh chemicals that stained his hands. He could feel the weight of expectation, the burden of his master's restless gaze upon him. "Quality is everything," the master had once said, his voice laced with the urgency of survival. "Without it, we are but beggars in this trade." As the mixture began to cool, the boys felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this batch would yield a color worthy of the noble's tunic, rich hue that would bring them favor. But as the boy dipped a scrap of cloth into the cauldron, a bitter realization washed over him. The color was dull, lifeless, a reflection of their struggle against the tides of fortune. The boy's heart sank anew, knowing they would be forced to face yet another round of disappointment, caught in the relentless cycle of dependency on suppliers who owed them nothing. In the heart of the medieval village, the sun set, casting a darkening veil over the boy's toil, leaving him to grapple with the harsh reality of his world, a world where the artistry of dyeing, once a craft of vibrant celebration, had become a bleak testament to their fragile existence. In the dim light of dawn, the small workshop nestled in the heart of the bustling village stirred to life, as the sound of splashing water and the sharp clatter of wooden tools echoed through the narrow streets. A heavy scent of earth and decay wafted through the air, mingling with the acrid tang of crushed woad and the bitter tang of madder roots simmering in large cauldrons. The dye worker, a stocky man named Edric, bent low over a vat, his back creaking with the strain of repeated labor. Each hunch and twist brought with it the faintest tingle of dread, for he knew all too well the price his craft exacted from his family. As he stirred the bubbling concoction, a flicker of movement caught his eye. His eldest son, Oswin, no more than 9 years, stood at the threshold, peering in with wide, curious eyes. The boy's innocence stood in stark contrast to the perils that lurked within the workshop. Edric's heart sank at the sight. The boy's skin glistened with the remnants of soot from their hearth, but it was the pallor of his complexion that drew a gasp from Edric's lips. The boy, like his siblings, had not escaped the lurking dangers of the dyes. "Stay away from here, Oswin," Edric called, his voice gruff with weariness. "The colors are not for children." "But father," Oswin protested, his voice a thin whisper, "I want to be strong like you. I want to help." A bitter smile crossed Edric's lips, for strength had little to do with the work of a dye maker. The chemicals he worked with were no mere colors. They were poisons that seeped into the air, settling like a fine dust on every surface. The repeated bending and stirring, the prolonged skin contact with the caustic substances, these were the burdens he bore alone, yet they threatened to ensnare his family within their deadly grasp. Edric's wife Alice had begun to cough more frequently, each spasm echoing through the cramped space they called home. The children, too, had grown weaker in health, their cheeks sunken, eyes dull, as though the vibrant hues of the dyes had drained the life from them. The once merry laughter that filled their hearth had dulled to murmurs. and in the quiet moments, the weight of impending illness lay heavy on their shoulders. With a sigh, Edric turned back to his work, the wooden stir creaking as he resumed its rhythmic motion. The toxins and the dyes clung to him like a shroud, suffocating and unrelenting. Each time he returned home, he brought with him more than the vivid colors that adorned the fine garments of nobles. He brought illness, despair, and the threat of a lingering shadow that loomed over their modest lives. As the hours passed, the sun rose higher, casting a harsh light upon the workshop. Edric wiped his brow, feeling the sweat mix with the grime and chemicals that stained his skin, who had taken a hesitant step closer, as if drawn to the allure of the colors swirling within the vat. Edric's heart tightened with an aching foreboding. What future awaited his son? The craft was a curse as much as it was a livelihood, a line drawn between survival and the well-being of those he loved most. The afternoon wore on, and the weight of his choices pressed heavily upon him, as Edric realized that the very art that breathed life into the fabric of their community threatened to unravel the threads of his family's existence. Thus, in the heart of the vibrant workshop, amidst the colors of life, lay the grim specter of death, a reminder that to wield beauty came at a price far steeper than he dared to fathom. The air in the dye house hung thick with the acrid scent of crushed madder root and the sharp tang of woad, swirling together in a noxious miasma that clung to the back of the throat. Young Tom, no more than 14 summers, bent low over the bubbling cauldron, the heat from the flames licking at his legs through the frayed hem of his tunic. His hands, stained a mottled blue from weeks of toil, trembled as he stirred the mixture with a long wooden paddle, the muscles in his arms straining against the effort. Each repetitive motion forced him to lean closer to the swirling brew, the steam rising in hazy tendrils that fogged his vision and filled his lungs with a heady mix of chemicals and smoke. The master dyer, a grizzled man named Galdric, hovered nearby, his beady eyes scrutinizing every flick of Tom's wrist. "Careful, lad, don't spill it now," he barked, as if Tom's clumsiness could somehow ruin the precious pigments they were crafting. Tom nodded vigorously, though fear gnawed at his insides. He had heard the stories of other boys who had succumbed to the fumes, men who had lost their sight or their wits from the very colors they produced. As Tom continued his work, he caught sight of the old barrels lining the walls, their surfaces slick with vibrant hues. Each barrel contained a different potion of danger, waiting to seep into the skin. The dyes were made from materials both beautiful and treacherous, the deep reds of cochineal insects, the bright yellows of saffron, and the vivid greens of copper. Yet there was little knowledge of the perils they posed. Galdric had often tossed a dismissive hand when anyone mentioned the risks, pushing aside the boy's fleeting concerns with a wave of his grimy palm. "A man must work for his bread, lad. You'll not find fortune without a bit of folly." With every stir of the cauldron, Tom felt the tension build, the way the heat wrapped around him, pressing against his skin, the sweat trickling down his back. He could not help but wonder what unseen threats their craft concealed. His fingers itched, and the tremors in his hands hinted at something more than mere fatigue. Was it the exposure to the dyes, the way the colors seeped into his skin, staining him from the outside in? "Finish up, boy." Galdric's voice cut through the haze of Tom's thoughts. The old man's shadow loomed over him, casting a pall over the boy's growing unease. "We've got a shipment to prepare, and I'll not have you dragging your feet like a sloth." Tom forced himself to focus, but the weight of the cauldron and the oppressive air bore down on him. He could feel the heat rising inside him, a deeper danger than the fiery flames beneath the pot. It was the fear of a life spent in ignorance, surrounded by the bright colors of his trade, yet forever shrouded in the dark shadows of potential ruin. He longed to escape the confines of the dye house, to breathe fresh air untainted by the residue of their labor. But as he stirred, the cauldron bubbled with an ominous ferocity, and the steam coiled around him like a serpent, tightening its grip. Each moment spent there carved away at his spirit, a slow erosion of youthful wonder, leaving behind a boy engulfed in vulnerability, trapped within the very colors that painted his world. The air inside the dye workshop hung thick with the acrid tang of crushed matter and the fetid scent of urine, both essential ingredients in the alchemy of color. Sunlight, filtered through grimy windows, barely penetrated the heavy haze that clung to the rafters like a shroud. Young boys, no older than 14 and often younger, toiled under the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. Their faces smudged with hues of indigo and saffron, remnants of their labor, clinging to their skin like the burdens of their lives. They stood in a half-circle around the great wooden vat, a vessel filled with steaming water and the toxic concoction that would transform dull cloth into vibrant shades. Each boy bent low, the repetitive motion of stirring the viscous brew leading to aching backs and strained muscles. One lad, Thomas, gritted his teeth as he plunged the wooden paddle into the mixture for the umpteenth time, his arms trembling under the strain. Yet the task was never done. The dye demanded unyielding attention, for neglect, even for the briefest moment, could result in a ruined batch, a loss not just of color, but of coin. The workshop was an echo of despair. The only sounds punctuating the otherwise stifling silence were the splashes of dye and the labored breaths of the boys. Each inhalation was laced with the harsh chemicals that seeped into their pores, dulling their minds and sapping their spirits. The weight of exhaustion settled over them like a thick blanket, a sense of futility creeping in as the hours dragged on. They were nothing more than cogs in a relentless machine, the rhythm of their labor marked by the ringing of the bell that signaled the end of the day. Yet the end was an illusion. More work awaited them at home, for their families depended on the meager wages they earned. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Thomas felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest, a suffocating sense of hopelessness. The dye was more than just a livelihood. It seeped into the very essence of their beings, turning vibrant dreams into faded memories. He watched as his fellow workers, once spirited lads full of laughter, had grown quiet, their eyes dulled by the relentless grind of their existence. The boy beside him, a slight lad named Peter, had begun to cough, a harsh rattle that echoed through the workshop, a sign of the toxicity they breathed, day in and day out. "Just a bit longer," Thomas murmured, though the words felt hollow. The promise of a brighter future with each thread dyed seemed a cruel jest. A sense of camaraderie had once bound them, but now it frayed like the edges of the cloth they worked with. Each boy was trapped within an invisible cage, their dreams strangled by the demands of survival. As twilight deepened, the shadows in the workshop lengthened, mirroring the mounting weight on their young shoulders. The flickering candles struggled to illuminate the dim corners of despair, casting erratic shadows that danced mockingly on the walls. Each lad knew the toll of their toil would not only mark their bodies, but etch lines of sorrow upon their souls. With hearts heavy as the leaden skies above, they returned to their labor, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same wearisome cycle, again and again, until the colors of life faded into a monochrome existence. In a dimly lit workshop, the air hung heavy with the acrid scent of crushed madder root and the sickly sweetness of woad. The flickering light of tallow candles did little to pierce the gloom, casting long shadows that danced along the rough-hewn walls. Young boys, barely past their childhood, bent over vats brimming with noxious liquids, their hands submerged in the swirling depths of dye. Each stroke of the ladle drew forth a mixture of vibrant color and hidden peril, a blend of hues that would soon adorn the garments of the wealthy. Yet for these boys, the labor was a prelude to suffering, the colors a deceptive veil that masked their cruel fate. With every day, the repetitive motions took their toll, bending the boys low until their spines ached and their muscles screamed for respite. The dye worker's life was a relentless cycle of toil: plunge, stir, lift, rinse. The boys' fingers grew raw, the skin chafed and blistered from the harsh chemicals that leached into their very being. The laughter of youth vanished beneath the weight of labor, replaced by the dull rhythm of survival. In the very act of creating beauty for others, they were entangled in a web of despair, their lives measured not in years, but in the fading colors of their health. The workshop was filled with the ghosts of those who had come before, men whose lives had flickered and dimmed like the dying flames in the hearth. A lad of 10, known as Tomas, recalled the stories of his father, a once vibrant figure who had succumbed to the malaise that crept upon him after years of mixing and stirring. The whispers of the past echoed in the boy's mind as he worked, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the same fate awaited him and his kin. Each cough that escaped his lips was a reminder of the legacy he bore, a dark inheritance of suffering that clung to him like the stains on his tunic. Outside, the world teemed with life and laughter, but within the confines of the dye house, the air was thick with hopelessness. The boys would often steal glances at the sun-dappled streets, where children played with carefree abandon, their futures untainted by the burdens of labor. But for them, such joys were fleeting dreams, replaced by the stark reality of their existence. The clang of metal against wood marked the passing hours, a cruel metronome of despair that dictated their lives. The toxins seeped into their skin, leaving behind a legacy of suffering that extended beyond their own frail bodies. Families were left grieving, mourning the loss of brothers, fathers, and sons who had been claimed by the very craft that sustained them. The cycle of poverty twisted tighter with each passing year, as widows struggled to feed their remaining children, forcing them into the same grim trade. In this relentless cycle, hope withered like the flowers in a forgotten garden, choked by the weeds of despair. As night fell, the boys would gather in a corner, their voices hushed, sharing tales of a brighter tomorrow, one where the colors they mixed were not just a precursor to their demise. Yet even as they spoke of dreams, the reality loomed like a specter, casting a long shadow over their lives, reminding them that in the world of dye and toil, few managed to escape the legacy of suffering that had bound their families for generations.